C, I do speak Spanish, so if we want to switch to Spanish, we can do C is fine with me. But no, thank you again. So I just want to briefly talk about the GRE program, the Graduate Record Examinations program, and the subject test in mathematics in particular, and also talk in general terms about the principles and best practices that we follow at ETS in terms of test development. ETS is the world's largest private not-for-profit educational testing and measurement organization. We have about 3,000 employees, and each year develop, administer, and score more than 50 million tests, including the GRE, but also examinations you may be familiar with, like the TOEFL, the TOEIC, and the Praxis tests. We are a mission-driven organization, and the mission is quite simple: to advance quality and equity in education by providing fair and valid assessments and related services. And we believe that our assessments measure critical knowledge and skills and help promote learning and achievement by individuals who participate in the many testing programs that we oversee. And all of our work is founded in very solid science and research in the field of measurement and testing. The GRE tests were created about 50 years ago to provide an objective lens through which all graduate school applicants can be fairly evaluated and compared regardless of their background. And so, like other standardized tests, GRE tries to be a leveler of the playing field, as we say in the United States. There are two primary programs in the GRE universe. That's the general test, which you're familiar with, I'm sure. It tests three critical areas: verbal reasoning, quantitative reasoning, and analytical writing. And then the GRE subject tests, which are in 6 different content areas, and mathematics being one of them. The test itself, the GRE Mathematics Test, is all multiple choice items or questions. There are approximately 66 that are administered in a time frame of about 170 minutes. Students are allowed to have that long to finish the assessment. Approximately 50% of the questions involve calculus and its applications. About 25% are in algebra, linear algebra, and number theory. And then the other 25% are basically other topics that are studied by undergraduates in institutions in the United States and worldwide. The assessment itself is based on a very detailed survey that is conducted and re-administered every few years to make sure that the test remains current with what is being taught in mathematics departments around the world. The test development process at ETS is fairly straightforward to describe. As I was working on this presentation, given the limited time frame, I wanted to be very focused, and so it's just a few steps I'll be outlining. But I do want to say that essentially what I am describing here in a few minutes is a process that for a normal testing program like the GRE Subject Test in Mathematics takes approximately 18 to 24 months from the time a test question is initially drafted by a test developer and the test itself is assembled and administered in the way that we administer tests. It's essentially a 2-year process. Step 1, of course, in any quality testing program is to clearly define the objectives. And so the ETS process begins with a very extensive design phase for any assessment. And as I said, we frequently kind of every few years at least revisit our design assumptions about current assessments like the GRE Subject Test in Math to make sure that the test is still meeting the design objectives. And those objectives are determined by answering some very basic questions. Who will take the test and for what purpose? What skills, areas of knowledge should we test? How should the test takers be able to use and demonstrate that knowledge? And what kinds of questions should be included? How long, how difficult, etc. These are all kind of design questions that we go through. We work very closely with external experts in the fields, in the assessments that we develop. While we have a very strong team at ETS of both psychometricians and statisticians and test developers, I myself was a test developer for many years, working in my field of history and social sciences. We have people with very strong academic backgrounds, teaching experience, and of course, measurement experience who work on our tests. But we don't rely solely on our own expertise. We work very closely with external experts like you all to actually develop our assessments. So each program in the GRE program has a committee of examiners, is what we call them. And that committee is responsible for, again, helping us to define and refine test objectives, make sure all of our test questions are unbiased, helping us determine test format and considering supplemental materials, etc. And they review and revise with us each and every question that is ever administered on an ETS test. The process of writing and review questions, as I just described, takes place over a long period. And they are primarily written by ETS staff and external experts on the item development committees. And sometimes we actually, for the purposes of a new program, for example, enlist the assistance of dozens of external experts to help us draft questions. Not all questions, especially in the GRE program, are developed solely by ETS staff. They are all developed with external expertise. And then the process of review is what takes that long period of numerous reviews and revisions to ensure the test items are meeting specifications once we have gone through that design process and decided what the test itself should be. These are just the basic steps in an item review process at ETS. Of course, the item author is the person who starts the process, but we go through at least 2 rounds of what we call content review. Again, these are subject matter experts who will review, revise, and make recommendations about how to improve the question. There is a separate and critical process of fairness review, where we look at the item to see that it is performing without differential effects, depending on the test taker's background, to make sure that the test is fair and valid. There's editorial review, external review, and then, of course, the technical review, formatting, etc. All items are pre-tested. So essentially, once a question has been written and reviewed and gone through that whole development process I just described, it's not just simply administered for scoring purposes. It is put into what we call a pretest module. And essentially, the test results from that do not affect the test taker's score, but they do allow us to analyze the question to see if, in fact, it is performing appropriately from a statistical perspective. We look at the difficulty of the question, if there are any ambiguities or errors still, even despite all of our review process in the question. Should they be revised? Should they be eliminated? And if there are options or incorrect alternative answers that need to be revised or replaced. ETS has a very stringent set of standards, internal standards. They're based on the testing standards from the AERA and NCME, but we have our own ETS standards for quality and fairness. Those standards guide all of our test development process and training. Reviewers, test developers, and reviewers are trained to work in a very clear way to identify and eliminate, wherever possible, bias that might be introduced by the human being who's working in the test development process in the items. And so we look for things like language, symbols, words, phrases, content that is generally regarded as either sexist or racist or otherwise inappropriate. And of course, we eliminate those elements from any test question before it's ever pre-tested. And if after pre-testing any of those elements are identified, the item is either revised or eliminated. And the way we do that is through differential item functioning, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. If you're psychometricians and statisticians, essentially it's a process, a statistical analysis that allows us to very carefully analyze each question and each option in a multiple choice question to see if, in fact, the item is performing in a way differentially, depending on where the test taker is from, the group the test taker is from. We look at gender, obviously, differences, and we look at racial and ethnic differences. And so we, again, eliminate any questions that are functioning differentially based on those characteristics. And after all of that, statistical analysis in the pretest mode and what we call preliminary item analysis, which happens even after a test has been pre-tested. Every time a test is administered, it goes through preliminary item analysis where these same analyses are done to ensure that the test items are still functioning properly. The test is finally assembled in operational mode, reviewed by outside specialists, and then prepared for administration and for scoring for students. Once that process is complete, after each and every test administration, the test is, as I said, continually reviewed and revised based on statistical analysis. And if questions are deemed, for whatever reason, to not be performing appropriately and they cannot be revised accurately, they are eliminated. Here's just a very simple, not simple, but a graphic illustration of one of the analyses that we do. Essentially, this is a good item, a 4-option multiple choice question. Essentially, you can see here what we want to see when we're looking at these types of analyses. Each of the lines essentially is an option in the 4-choice multiple choice question. What you want to see is the correct option, which in this case is indicated by the asterisk, the option D. You want to see this, where the criterion score on the bottom is essentially from, shows student performance on the assessment overall. So the lower performing students are at the beginning of the axis and the higher performing students are at the end of the axis. What you want to see is that a correct answer, as the ability of the test taker improves, that's the question, that's the answer that test takers are in fact opting for. And the other options should be attractive, what we call attractive distractors, so that they are plausible responses to the question, but incorrect and clearly incorrect. And that's what this graphic shows. Here's an example of a bad item. And essentially here the correct option is B, but you can see that all of the lines are essentially flat and are essentially not distinguishing clearly among the test takers. And so the option here clearly is flagged for statistical purposes. And I believe this item was ultimately deemed unsalvageable and was not used. But this is one of the ways that we kind of look at test and item analysis to make determinations.